Okay. Hello, everyone. First, thank you for attending the last session of the second day. We're very happy that the special session on global value chains and sustainable development was among the selected sessions for the annual conference. And the idea of this session is to present one of the recent topics that are currently debated at both the academic and the policy levels, which is global value chains and to what extent they can be affected by different factors. And that's why we will try to focus in this session on global value chains, but from a sustainable development perspective. And by sustainable development perspective, we try to combine three main, let's say, groups of factors. One at the macro level, focusing on exchange rate policy and its role in promoting global value chains. Then we try also to examine the environmental dimension of global value chain, to what extent global value chains can be affected by the environmental stringency in emerging countries. And finally, we try to look at the governance issue of global value chains, where we examine in the third paper the role of political connections in boosting or in integrating into global value chains. So I'm very happy to be part of this panel with my colleagues Nada Hazem from Cairo University and the University of Paris 1, and Nora Aboushady from IDOS and from Cairo University. So I'll be presenting the first paper on the role of exchange rate and global value chains. Nada will be presenting the paper on environment and global value chains, and Nora the paper on political connections and global value chains. So we're going to have around 20 minutes maximum per paper, followed by 10 minutes Q&As from the floor, and we'll do this for the three papers. So I will start. Nada, would you please keep the time for me? Okay, so for the first paper, it's co-authored with Mariz Abdou from the University of Clermont, Auvergne, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi and Patrick Plan also from Cergy, Clermont, Auvergne. And we try to see how exchange rate undervaluation can affect global value chain participation. So the basic idea of this paper is based on the literature that examines the role of undervaluation on exports. And it was clear in different papers, especially the seminal paper of Roderick, that undervaluation can be an important factor for boosting exports, especially when we have deficient institutions. So it can be perceived as a second best to promote exports. So that's why, while the effect is clear for exports, it might be a bit different for global value chains, in the sense that for global value chains, they incorporate both exports and imports. And that's why, perhaps, given that it will be a common factor between the different papers, I want to spend some few minutes to explain the idea of global value chains if we don't have some non-trade specialists. So basically, the idea of global value chains is that now it's becoming very difficult to talk about one product that is fully produced in one country. So we can have some components coming from a country, some services that can be outsourced in a country, until that the final product itself can be exported from a specific country, but it includes a host of other countries that participates into the production of this good. So that's why, in general, in the global value chain literature, we distinguish between the backward participation and the forward participation. And in this literature also, they can be measured through the foreign value added that is included in our own exports. So for instance, what I will import from Japan, and that will be used in my exports that I'm going to export to Germany, let's say. And it can be also perceived as the domestic value added, what I'm producing domestically, and that will be used in the exports of my partners. So for instance, Egypt is producing cotton, and it will export this cotton to Tunisia, and Tunisia will process the cotton to export the ready-made garments to France, for instance. So that's why we will try throughout the different papers to examine both forward and backward linkages. And specifically in this macro paper, the main argument that we try to examine to what extent undervaluation can work, again, in an environment where we have deficient institutions, but to what extent also, given that global value chains, they incorporate several stages of production. So having a higher level of digitalization can improve the coordination between the different slots of the value chain or reduce this coordination cost. So that's why the literature on undervaluation and its effect on export competitiveness in general argues that the effect of undervaluation will be contingent on two main factors so far. As I said in the beginning, the quality of institutions. So when we have deficient institutions, undervaluation can work as a substitute. And it's also contingent on the development level. So in general, it can work for mainly low and middle income countries and much less for high income countries. The effect for global value chains, given that it includes both exports and imports, might be less straightforward in the sense that my undervaluation can promote exports, but the effect on imports can be negative in the sense that if I have an undervalued currency, this is going to increase, this might not help me import a lot if my currency is undervalued, and therefore the effect, when we compare the effect of traditional trade versus global value chain, it can become less straightforward. So there are several papers that, as I said in the beginning, that show to what extent exports can be promoted through undervaluation, sorry, but much less for global value chains. And to a certain extent, also given that we have the two dimensions of global value chains, which is the foreign value added that is included in our exports, and the domestic value added that is included in the exports of our partners, both can be complementary. So this also will be tested in the paper to see to what extent this undervaluation policy can help increase both what we call the DVX, which is the foreign value add, which is the domestic value added included in the exports of our partners, or the foreign value added, which is the FVA, as we will show throughout the paper. So the special focus of this paper is to see whether this policy is going to work in a context of weak institutions first, and how the level of digitalization can reduce the coordination cost and therefore work also in an environment where we have a higher level of digital adoption. Given that in general, the two factors per se have been also studied in the literature to see to what extent they can promote exports. So what we do in this paper, we examine the exchange rate undervaluation on the two main components on global value chain participation. So the DVX, which is the forward GVC participation, and the FVA, which is the backward participation. And then we investigate how this effect is contingent on some other factors, which are weak institutions or the quality of institutions and the digital adoption. And we try also to see whether this effect is dependent also or is contingent on the position within the value chain, which means that it's more in the upstream part of the value chain or more the downstream part of the value chain. So also the position within the value chain, and I will come back to this later. The key findings, if I don't have time to finish the presentation, so that first, the exchange undervaluation has a positive and significant effect on both the backward and the forward participation into global value chains, which means that it's still, well, I mean, the main conclusion from the exports and exchange rate literatures applies to the global value chain on the one hand, and on the other, it especially works when we have deficient institutions and when we have a higher level of digital adoption. And in general, this result is robust in different specifications, and especially for low and middle income countries. When we take into consideration the position within the value chain, the main results are first, that undervaluation in general has a positive impact on forward participation, regardless of the position of the country, whether it's in the downstream part, which means closer
to the consumption, to the product that is consumed, which means closer to the consumer, or the upstream part, which is closer to the producer. So in general, the undervaluation effect is positive regardless of the position when it comes to the forward participation. For the backward participation, the impact of the undervaluation, it's positive and significant only for the downstream countries that are closer to the consumer. But we found also a negative, but for the upstream part in the backward linkage, it was negative. And as I said, the result remain robust whether we control for the endogeneity of undervaluation or we test the difference between undervaluation and overvaluation, because perhaps I will keep this for now if we have time, and when we also run the regressions by income level. So I will briefly go through the data that we used, our methodology, the empirical findings, and some robustness checks. So we proceed in three stages. We first determine the real effective exchange rate following the Balassa and Samuelson effect and what was done in the seminal paper of Roddick in his paper of 2008, where we simply calculate the real effective exchange rate as the adjusted exchange rate for the purchasing power parity that controls for the price level between different countries. So as you can see here in this equation, we calculate first the real effective exchange rate. Sorry, the real exchange rate, not the real effective, the real exchange rate, which is the ratio between the nominal exchange rate and the price index. And then based on that, we regress the real effective exchange rate on the GDP per capita to get or to calculate the Balassa-Samuelson effect and to predict the exchange rate of equilibrium. And in our estimations, we get a coefficient that is very similar to the one that was estimated by Roddick in his paper. So we get a coefficient of 0.25, while in his paper it was 0.24, which shows that our estimations are in line with the literature. And this shows that according to the Balassa-Samuelson effect, if we have an increase in the GDP per capita, this will lead to an appreciation of the currency, which we observe in our data set. And just an important point here, the increase of the value of the exchange rate means a depreciation. That's why we get a negative coefficient. Then once we have the Balassa-Samuelson effect, we calculate the undervaluation, where we compare the exchange rate of the level of equilibrium of the exchange rate, which is the predicted one from the previous stage, compared to the observed one. And if we have positive values, this means that the currency is undervalued. If we have a negative one, this means that the currency is overvalued. When we look at the descriptive statistics, of those estimations, we can see that for countries that have an undervalued currency, they are mainly in low middle income countries and upper middle income countries, the column positive values, as you can see, between positive and negative for low and middle income countries, it's almost 50%, 50%. For upper middle income countries, more of them, they have undervalued currencies compared to those who have an overvaluation. But for high income countries, most of them, they have an overvalued currency. Just a second. Yes. Then once we have the data for the real effective exchange, for the real exchange rate, we rely on the UNCTAD EORA database that calculates both the backward and the forward linkage for the global value chains using input-output tables at the global level. And for the foreign value added, as I said, it's the value added produced by other countries and that is included in our own exports. And for the DVX, it's our domestic value added that is included in the exports of our partners. So we have both measures in the paper, and we have this for 143 countries between 1995 and 2018. And just to have a flavor of the descriptive statistics here, as you can see, the evolution of global value chains for the two measures DVX and FVA over time by different income levels. And for low and middle income countries, we can see that the DVX is much higher than the FVA on the upper right hand side on the slide, while for high income countries, more or less they are the same. When we look at the correlation between our two variables of interest, we can see that there is a positive correlation for both DVX and FVA only for developing countries, while the correlation is negative for developed countries, which prima facie show to what extent that there is a positive association between global value chain and undervaluation for developing countries who are likely to have more deficient institutions. Then our other controls that we introduced to measure first our two variables of interest. We introduced two measures of institutions, one that measures the quality of institutions in general using the government effectiveness index from the World Governance Indicator, and the financial institution efficiency index from the IMF. So just as two measures that can affect global value chains. Then the second control also that we include is the digital adoption that we measure with the proportion of individuals using internet. It's not the best way to measure the digital adoption, but to have a comparable measure, that's the best that we could have. Then for the analysis itself, we proceed in two steps. First, given that we have some macro variables, so we first test for the existence of stationarity in our database using the unit root test and the panel co-integration analysis. And then once this is done, we estimate the relationship between the real exchange rate undervaluation and GVC participation. For the unit root test, it has we run the unit root test, and we found that some variables are stationary while others are integrated of order 1. And we also run the co-integration test, and we found a long-run relationship between our variables. But in order to reduce the bias of that we have from the fact that we have some variables that are stationary and others that are not stationary, we run a dynamic OLS that fits our analysis, but I don't have time to go through all that. So this is our specification, where the dependent variable is first domestic value added and the foreign value added, and the undervaluation that is estimated as I've shown in the beginning with country and year fixed effects. And then here, as you can see, for the ETA vector, it includes the different controls that we have, and we mainly focus on 3 controls in addition to institutions and the digital adoption, which are the real GDP per capita that controls for the income level, the applied tariff faced by country I or imposed by country I, depending on whether we are talking about FVA or DVX to control for trade policy, and the total rents of natural resources to control for natural resources endowments, given that they might reduce the likelihood of integration into value chain. So to present the results, as you can see in the first line, undervaluation has a positive and statistically significant association with both forward and backward linkage, whether we introduce the controls, the other variables of interest or not. And then for column B and column D, we can see that the interaction with government effectiveness is negative and significant, which shows that undervaluation will work in an environment where those institutions are not good, but the interaction is positive and significant when we interacted with the internet usage, which means that the digital adoption works or the effect of undervaluation will be higher in an environment where we have a higher level of digital adoption. But for the interaction with financial development, it was not significant for the backward linkage and negative and significant for the forward linkage. Then, given that undervaluation can be also a policy itself that can be done on purpose, if I want to be more integrated into global value chains, this means that there is a reverse causation between undervaluation and the integration into global value chain. So that's why we instrument both backward and forward linkage. For the backward linkage, we have two instruments, which are the leave one out mean of the undervaluation of region and year, in the sense that if my partners, they are undervaluing their currency, I might follow them in order to attract exports. Or another instrument which is the undervaluation of other countries that have similar structural characteristics. And by the similar structural characteristics, I mean the quality of institutions, the level of GDP per capita, and I don't remember the third variable. For forward linkage, we have two instruments, which are the undervaluation of the main trade partner, which might also give me more incentives to have an undervalued currency, and also the undervaluation over a block of countries that have the same characteristics. So in general, our instruments, they appear to satisfy the relevant conditions from the first stage and from the different tests that shows that the instrument is valid. And we can see that the effect is higher when we control for this endogeneity between global value chain and undervaluation, and still the same results hold, especially for the backward linkage and government effectiveness. Then, in order to measure the position within the value chain, we compare the domestic value added relative to the foreign value added and the our value added that is included in the exports of our partner, relative to which one is higher, and we compare this relative to the domestic value added itself. So if the difference is positive, this means that we are more in the downstream part of the value chain. If the difference is negative, this means that we are in the upstream part of the value chain. So once we do that, we still get the same positive effect, with the exception for the upstream part of the value chain for backward linkage. And our main argument is that in this case, the price effect can be, in this case, reducing the integration into value chain, given that the effect will be not cushioned as much as towards the end of the value chain, the downstream part. The first robustness check, we try also to take the absolute value of the level of misalignment and interact this level of misalignment with a dummy if it's an undervaluation, and that take the value of 1 if the misalignment is greater than 0, which means that it's an undervaluation, and 0 otherwise. So if this gamma 2, which is the coefficient of the interaction variable, is insignificant, this means that regardless of whether the currency is undervalued or overvalued, we're going to have an effect. If the gamma 2 is positive, this means that the impact is mainly driven by undervaluation, which is our argument. And if gamma 2 is negative, this means that the effect will be driven by overvaluation, just to make sure that the effect is really due to undervaluation. And what we found in the results is that the effect is mainly driven by undervaluation, not overvaluation. Then when we run the regressions by income level, we find that a positive and highly significant impact for forward linkage, an insignificant one for backward linkage, and then that's for upper middle income countries. For low middle income countries, there is a significant negative impact for both forward and backward linkage. And the argument here is that even if they have bad institutions, but most of them, they might not have the industrial base that help them be part of the value chain, which is, for instance, the case of African countries, that even though some of them, they have undervalued currency, but given that they are exporting primarily raw material or primary commodities, they are not very deeply integrated into global value chains. So to conclude, undervaluation exerts a positive impact on both forward and backward components of GVC participation, especially when institutions are deficient and where we have a higher level of digital adoption. The result is robust once we control for the IV, for the endogeneity between the two variables, and whether we test whether we have undervaluation or overvaluation, and for different income level. But clearly, from a policy perspective, we cannot really promote the fact that undervaluation is the best policy to promote global value chains, because it can be just perceived as a second best that can work in the short term and to help promote the competitiveness of exports in the short term. But clearly, the first best would be to let the currency be determined by the market itself and have in general the investment climate that promotes integrating into global value chain. But clearly, it's still perceived as an industrial policy or a substitute for industrial policy to promote exports in the short run. So that's why, even if this policy is doable in the short term, but it's not sustainable in the long run. And at the end of the day, deeper reforms will be needed, especially at the institutional level, if the country first wants to be more integrated into the global value chain, or especially upgrade within the value chain. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
I think we can have a few minutes for some questions or clarifications before we proceed to the second paper.
Thank you for this very interesting study and its interdisciplinary approach. My question is, how and where would you integrate the concept of economic freedom in this nexus of global value chains and sustainable development? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps I will respond. For economic freedom, I think it will be part of the institutions, but frankly, we haven't tried other measures of institutions, especially those of Freedom House, the Freedom House Index, for instance. But we do believe that most of the institutional variables are relatively correlated. Here we use the World Governance Indicators for, and specifically it was the Government Effectiveness Index. But in general, when we change the Government Effectiveness Index with rule of law or with the regulatory quality, the results are really unchanged. But we haven't tried the economic freedom, the Freedom House Index that explicitly measures economic freedom.
Okay, so you consider the worldwide governance indicators of the World Bank, particularly government effectiveness. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the paper. Exciting to hear about it. I'm interested in kind of how you model competition between countries. So obviously, if I'm China and I'm responding to Vietnam, say, I might undervalue, and then Vietnam responds. So how do we kind of model this interactive spillover that happens, or the competition that can occur, kind of a race to the bottom in undervaluation in currencies?
So you mean the competition at the undervaluation level, right? Not the competition for value chain itself.
No, I mean in the exchange rate decision.
Yes.
So China reduces its exchange rate in response to Vietnam reducing its exchange rate.
So I think we do this indirectly in the instrument variable that we use, especially for the forward participation part, because we are assuming that my exchange rate policy will be determined based on my main trade partner exchange rate. That's what we've done. But we perhaps we might also introduce this. You mean that it can be introduced as
a variable,
as a variable, not
so instead
we can try this
also minus I. So
yes.
It's also not clear how you would then kind of aggregate, because it's not just one trading partner. It's also like maybe you have 5 other trading partners and you want to average over their behavior. So that would be...
For this point specifically, we did two things. So first, we relied just on the first trade partner, so in terms of share, and we've run the exchange rate of this partner. And in one of the robustness checks also that we've done, we focused on or we considered, the top 10 trade partners that represent more or less 80% of the country's trade. And again, the results didn't change. So that's why, to make it, but it's in the appendix in all cases, but our main instrument, let's say, was just with the one with the main trade partner, as it's generally done in the literature.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the paper. Exciting. And I think, the strategic decision is interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Other comments? Okay, I think we can move to the second paper. So, Nada.
Okay, so hello everyone. So my name is Nora Hazem. I'm an assistant lecturer at Cairo University and also a PhD student at both Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne University, and Cairo University. And the paper that I'll be presenting now is co-authored with Chahir Zaki and is also a part of a research project that was funded by the World Bank's Office of the Chief Economist of the MENA region. So we're thankful for the comments of the World Bank staff, and we have already one from them among us today, Ernest Stringency. So mainly here we're trying to investigate how environmental stringency can influence the firm's participation in global value chains with a special focus on the MENA region, and how we can compare this to the rest of the world regions. So as we all know, the MENA region is one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of climate change, and this is why more MENA countries have started to implement different measures in order to mitigate these effects and to also shift towards a greener economy. So with that being said, we're also aware of the growing pattern in the international trade, the global value chains, and how they became a dominant feature of the international trade. However, when it comes to the MENA integration in these global value chains, the contribution remains very modest. But it has been proven in the literature that the MENA has, in fact, an untapped potential to make bigger contributions to global value chains, given its favorable location and also its abundant human capital. And that also, by integrating into global value chains, this can result in higher exports for the regions, enhanced employment opportunities, and also improved firm productivity. So with the importance of both upholding the environmental commitments, but at the same time, the need to foster the GVC integration, this paper tackles the effect of environmental stringency on the global value chain participation within the MENA region compared to the rest of the world. So I go briefly by the literature. So in general, the greater body of the literature mainly tackled the nexus between environmental stringency and the gross trade flows. However, a very limited number of papers have considered the trade in value added and this dimension of global value chains. But what we can take from this large body of literature is that we can more or less expect two effects for these environmental regulations. So you have on the one side this pollution heaven hypothesis that says that stricter environmental regulations would result in higher production costs for the domestic producers and hence a lower export competitiveness, and the extreme case that the most affected industries will tend to relocate to other countries that have weaker or more lenient environmental regulations. However, on the other hand, we have the Porter hypothesis that says that environmental regulations, in contrast, they can improve the export competitiveness by stimulating the innovative capacities of the firms and encouraging them to invest in technologies that are not only greener, but also more cost efficient. And actually, this is what we are trying to examine in this paper. We are trying to, one of the main contributions of the paper, that we're examining the validity of this Porter hypothesis in the context of different countries with a special focus on the MENA region. And also in order to proxy the environmental stringency, we are using two variables in order to account for both the internal and the external levels. So we're considering both the national environmental regulations set by the country itself and also the environmental treaties that are signed by this country. And lastly, we're also adopting a firm-level analysis, which is also a contribution because we're considering the firm-specific behavior and response to the environmental policies. So for our main data sources, we are using the World Bank Enterprise Surveys for the firm-level data. So it basically covers around 146 developing economies with a time span between 2006 till 2021. And for data on the environmental regulations and treaties, we are using the ECOLEX database. So before moving to the methodology part, I wanted to show you some stylized facts. So as you can see here, we can see how the number of environmental regulations and treaties signed by the MENA region has increased between 2006 till 2021. So what are these regulations or treaties about? Well, they target a wide scope of areas. As you can see, they can target the cultivation of plants, food and nutrition, energy, livestock, and so on. So this is for the environmental part. Now for the GVC part, in order to identify the firms that are part of a global value chain, we rely on a couple of definitions. So here I'm going to be mainly focusing on the simplest and the most strict definition. So the simplest definition says that a firm is considered to be a part of a global value chain if it's both an exporter and an importer, a two-way trader. While for the strictest definition, we're considering the firm to be a part of a global value chain if it's a two-way trader, it has an international quality certification, and also foreign ownership. A part of its capital is owned by a foreign entity. And if we take a look here, we can see that only 20% of the firms within the MENA region are two-way traders in our first column. And we can see how the share drops significantly when we increase the strictness of the definition. Like only 1.4% of the firms are two-way traders, have an international certification and foreign ownership. Okay, now for the model part. So as I mentioned here, for the dependent variable, we are using the GVC participation. And here we are measuring the GVC participation at both the extensive and the intensive level. So first, we are examining the effect on the likelihood of the firm to participate in a global value chain. And for this, we use the definitions that I just outlined. Then for the intensive margin, which is the depth or the intensity of this GVC participation. So basically, for the simple definition, we just multiply the share of exports by the share of imports, while for the strict definition that has the 4 criteria, we build a score using the principal component analysis, in which we consider these criteria of two-way trading, foreign ownership, and international certification. Now for the explanatory variables part, as I mentioned, here we're measuring the environmental stringency using both the number of domestic environmental regulations of a given country and also the number of environmental treaties that are signed by this country. We also include a set of firms' characteristics that are expected to affect the firm's GVC participation, such as the firm's age, if a share of its capital is owned by the government, and also the size of the firm, if it's a small versus a medium or large firm. And we also include a set of fixed effects, specifically year, country, city, and sector fixed effects. Okay, so now first for the results on the extensive margin, which is the likelihood of the firm to participate in a global value chain, we can see that here in both columns 3 and 6, how environmental regulations are associated with a higher likelihood of the firm to participate in a global value chain. And when we interacted in panel B with the MENA country, we can see that firms within the MENA can even benefit more from environmental regulations in terms of the positive enhancement on the likelihood to participate in a global value chain. However, when we look at the environmental treaties, we can see that the results tend to be less consistent. In some part, they're insignificant, sometimes they are negative. But a pattern that we observed in our regressions, that the effect tends to be positive when we're considering the strict definition, meaning that when we're considering that the firm has an international certification and foreign ownership, which also may make sense since that these criteria tend to be more sensitive to the international standards and international treaties in general. And also, we shouldn't forget the fact that environmental treaties tend to be more vague or less strictly implemented, which has been also shown in the literature how environmental regulations tend to be more effective in terms of generating economic outcomes compared to the international environmental treaties. Now, when we look at the intensive margin, so the depth or the intensity of the GVC participation, we barely see no effect. So there is no significant effect on the intensity or the depth of the GVC participation of the firm, which is also interesting because by saying that environmental regulations, the influence the likelihood to participate, but not the intensity of participation. So here it's like we're saying that these environmental regulations are more to be perceived as a cost by the firm that they need to overcome in order to integrate the global value chain, but wouldn't necessarily influence the intensity of their participation, which is also in line with the new trade literature regarding the investments like outcome of that the firm can do in this cleaner production process or cleaner infrastructure. However, the results for the intensive margin should be analyzed with caution because as we can see, when we consider the intensive margin, like almost 70% of our observations, we lose them because the intensive margin here can only be observed if the firm is a part of a global value chain. So, which may generate a selection bias. So what we do here is that we use a two-stage Heckman selection model to control for this bias. And the selection variable that we use here is the productivity, in line with Milit's, that more productive firms are more likely to here integrate global value chains. And actually, we ran separate regressions to make sure that the productivity influences only the extensive margin, but has no effect on the intensive margin. And in the Heckman results, we can see here how productivity is indeed positively associated with a higher likelihood or a higher likelihood that the firm be selected to participate in the global value chain. And more or less, the Heckman model results also confirm the idea that environmental regulations are more important to have an effect on the likelihood to participate, but not on the depth of the participation. And the same for environmental treaties, you have the same thing that the results tend to be non-conclusive or non-consistent. So now for the model extension. So what we try to do is to run a couple of extensions for our model. So the first thing is that we try to test further the validity of the Porter hypothesis. So we introduced a variable that measures research and development. So basically, if the firm has invested or spent on R&D in the past year, and we interacted with environmental regulations. And we have seen that spending on R&D do enhance the positive effect of the environmental regulations on the firm's GVC participation. So for the sake of time, so we have the results in here, but I don't think we have time to show it, but we can mainly observe how the interaction is mainly positive. And here actually we have a positive like effect for both the intensity and the likelihood to participate. So for the second extension, we try to also control for the institutional setting or context of the country, and hence the quality of enforcement of these environmental regulations. So we included a variable to proxy the institutional quality of the country. And here we are also using the worldwide governance indicators, mainly the government effectiveness one. And we did so that government effectiveness positively affects the GVC participation of the firm at both the intensive and extensive margins. Now for the third extension, we differentiate the effect between the firm of different sizes. So we basically differentiate between small and medium enterprises and the large enterprises. And surprisingly, here we can see that both SMEs and large firms can benefit from environmental regulations, and how this effect is particularly stronger for SMEs when they hold a foreign certification and have foreign ownership. As you can see here for the results. Okay. So now for the last extension, here we differentiate between the different sectors, since some sectors tend to be more polluting than others. So what we try to do is to examine the heterogeneous impact of environmental regulations on different sectors. And we observe that environmental regulations are associated with a higher GVC integrating in some non-polluting sectors, specifically the agriculture and processed food sectors, which also presents an opportunity to benefit from the comparative advantage that some MENA countries have in the agricultural exports, like Tunisia, Morocco, or Egypt, of course. However, it's important to note that a better compliance of these agricultural exports or products with the international standards would be a must in order to untap this potential. So finally, we also ran 2 robustness checks. So the first one pertains to the use of a multi-level mixed effects model. So basically here we just allow our model to take into account the fact we have different levels in our data. So we have the macro level part, which is represented by the environmental indicators, and the micro level part represented by the firm characteristics and its GVC participation. And actually, when we ran this model, it has also confirmed the results that we had previously. The second robustness check that we did is that we dropped the top exporters from the model in order to make sure that our results are not mainly driven by the large exporters. And it's also a way to try to address the indigeneity that we might have in our model, because the rationale here is that large firms are the ones that tend to lobby for or against environmental regulations and can hence influence the decisions of implementing environmental regulations or the ratification of international treaties. And when dropping the top exporting firms, the results have not changed. So to conclude, we have seen that environmental regulations increase the likelihood of the firm to participate in a global value chain when it's measured using both the sample or the strict definitions, which validates the Porter hypothesis. And also, we have seen how the spending or investment in R&D can increase this positive effect of environmental regulations on the GVC participation. We have also seen that both SMEs and large firms benefit from such regulations. However, the results for the environmental treaties tend to be less conclusive. And lastly, but also most importantly, the policy implications of the paper. So first of all, the paper confirms the idea that it's possible to achieve a balance between environmental sustainability and also economic growth or trade growth in general. And since we have seen that spending on R&D is a must, then it's important for the governments within the MENA region to adopt policies that would foster the green innovation through more budget allocations for R&D or even a high protection of the intellectual property rights. And finally, investing in cleaner infrastructure would be also indispensable in order to support the firms, specifically the SMEs, to abide by these environmental regulations or treaties. So thank you so much for your attention and waiting for your comments. Thank you.
We can have a few minutes for some questions. Yasmin?
Thank you, Nada, for the presentation. It's really a great effort and the presentation is very nice. I have just a clarification question regarding the GVC intensive measure, because we are working on a paper that we also measured the intensive margin of GVC. So I understood that you are dropping all the values that have zero intensive GVC, and you are only including the greater than 1 or greater than 0 GVC intensive, because you have a number of observations of 20,000, 23,000. So are you dropping the 0 intensive margin?
Because in order to measure the intensity, we would need to have already a firm that is participating in the value chain, because we're basically, for the simple definition, we're multiplying the share of exports by the share of imports. So we would need to have them as non-zeros in order for the measure to exist. So this is why we tend to have this drop in the observations. And same goes when we go for the strict definition, because we're using the score. So in order to have a score, we need these variables to be non-zeros. And this is why, yeah, we drop the FIM when it's not already a part of a global value chain. And this is why we need to use the Heckman model to prove that the selection bias is not really the one controlling the results or driving our coefficients. Yes.
Thank you, Nada.
Other questions or comments? Okay. If not, then we're on time. We can move to the third paper. Thank you, Nada. Nora.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Chahir, for the introduction. Thanks for everyone who is still here. I'll try to be quick because this is the last presentation and we've had a very long day. So the last paper of this session is co-authored with my colleague Chahir Zaki on global value chains and business-state relations in the MENA region. It has also, or an extended version of this paper has been published as an IDOS discussion paper by the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. To give you the background on the MENA context, I prefer to look here actually. So we know that trade and investment reforms in the MENA region were often accompanied by rising business-state relations. And some of our colleagues at ERF as well have extensively worked on how business-state relations, or the so-called crony capitalism, has proliferated accompanying episodes of trade liberalization as early as the 90s in MENA countries like Egypt or Tunisia or Jordan. And what we know about it is that key business persons were increasingly engaged in the policy making or in the parliament, for example, as members of the parliament or part of the government and so on. At the same time, they were CEOs or owners of firms, and they managed to influence policies in their favor. So either to protect them or to foster their participation in the global economy. For example, sometimes the trade and investment policies were tailored to protect specific sectors. And I think we do have some clear cases in our minds. So basically, the policies were largely shaped to suit the interest of these connected business persons. And as I mentioned, trade liberalization was heavily accompanied by a rise in other measures beyond tariffs, like non-tariff measures, for example. And there is a small but growing literature on business-state relations and participation of these firms in the global economy in the MENA region, alongside other performance indicators. What triggered us actually to work on this topic, besides the availability of cross-country data, is that despite the Arab Spring and like drastic changes that we thought happened in the region, business-state relations remain more or less predominant in the economies, and some of the old elites also have not really disappeared, and they managed to come back and reintegrate in the economy and influence policies in their favor. So what we basically do is that we extend the literature on business-state relations in the MENA region by investigating to which extent political connections or other measures of political influence reflecting business-state relations can foster or can affect firms' participation in the global economy through global value chains. So we investigate if political connections matter for these firms compared to non-politically connected firms. What is the role of corruption, grand corruption, and petty corruption in actually strengthening this impact? And if also being politically connected allows the firm to overcome trade and investment related barriers or restrictions and foster its engagement in global value chains. Thereby, we link several strands of the literature. We do not only focus on the literature in the MENA region, on the political economy of trade policy in the MENA region, but we also contribute to the literature of firm heterogeneity in international trade by considering political connections as one of the main characteristics related to firm behavior that may allow firms to better integrate in the global economy. And we also thereby contribute to the literature on global value chains at the firm level. We use the new data on political connections that were published by the World Bank and the World Bank Enterprise Survey at the firm level for the 6 MENA countries for which we have the data availability, which are Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and the West Bank and Gaza. We do not only focus on political connections because the literature also talks about the cost of political connections and also links political connections to corruption at the high level, grand corruption. So we also extract variables from the survey on grand corruption. And we also test for several other measures of influence like collective lobbying and petty corruption sometimes, just to check how things look like empirically. So we test these alternative measures and we test their impact on the extensive and intensive margin of global value chain participation, which Nada has explained. Also, we follow the same definition of global value chains, but we focus on the shallowest definition, which is firms' engagement in value chains through exports and imports, and the deepest definition, which is a firm's engagement in value chains through two-way trade, international certification, and foreign ownership. So my presentation will look as follows. First, I give you a brief overview of firms' political connections in the MENA region. I briefly describe the methodology and the most important results. And finally, I conclude. So for firms' political connections in the MENA region, firms can, as I mentioned at the introduction, influence policies through several channels. Firms can be politically connected and can shape policies, therefore, in their favors by having not only shape policies in their favors, but they can also have a privileged access to information, to resources, to also exemptions from specific barriers or restrictions related to trade and investment. Firms can also collectively influence policies, and that would send us to the literature by Grossman and Helpman on the protection for sale model, where organized sectors are able to influence trade policies in their favor compared to non-organized sectors. Firms can also, and this is a growing body of literature actually that suggests that political connections come at a cost, because being politically connected gives you access to the policymaker through that person who is politically connected, but it doesn't necessarily tailor the policies in your favor unless you really pay. And you do not pay like for the mid-level officials, for example, to escape some inspection or something like that. But politically connected firms can also engage in grand corruption, meaning that they exchange favors or payments with high-level officials to change the policies or the laws in their favor. And there have been, of course, cases in the MENA countries for that. So this graph illustrates the firm political connectedness by country. We were deeply frustrated when we extracted the data and had a look at it, because only 6% on average of the firms in the 6 countries are politically connected. Of course, there is a substantial cross-country heterogeneity, because we see that in Tunisia, 28% of the firms are politically connected, while surprisingly in Lebanon, for example, only I can't even see the share. It's 1 or 2% of the firms are politically connected, which I know is completely misleading. But actually, when we look at the definition of political connections, it's a very strict definition to allow for cross-country comparison. And this is highly problematic even for us, because we are trying to submit the paper now and we keep getting the comment on that politically connectedness all the time. So a firm, according to the World Bank definition, is politically connected if the top manager or the CEO or the owner or someone from the board has been appointed or is appointed at a political position. And while this allows for like a standardization or harmonization of the definition across countries to be able to measure that, at the same time, it doesn't capture the whole picture in terms of political connections, because it drops, for example, families who run businesses, and these families have someone who's politically connected. It drops the fact that one of those top managers of a firm may have a friend who's politically connected, or that this person is actually who runs the firm is not politically connected, but he's not the real owner of the firm. He's someone who's there officially, but the firm is run and owned by someone else. And this is just a shell entity, for example. But at the same time, we do not have cross-country data other than that. So we accept the fact that this tends to be an underestimation of the real picture. At the same time, we do recognize that political connections can be connected or tend to be connected in the region to a small set of firms who tend to be also large firms, because political connections are interesting for large firms. They are the ones who do the operations, who realize the largest profits, and who have the top performance indicators. And this is why they need these privileges and these access to resources and information and so on. And they are the ones who can pay for the cost of political connections and of changing laws and policies in their favor. So maybe this also goes hand in hand with the share of large firms in the MENA region. So there are some positive correlations on that. When we look at firms' political connections and grand corruption, we also see that the share of firms who are at the same time politically connected and may recognize the importance of grand corruption, of paying to high-level officials to change laws and policies and decrees, we realize that this share, which is not really very visible because it's the light orange or the yellow part, tends to be also relatively small. Again, this has to do with, or this is driven by the small share of political connections on average. But if we look at the orange part, the orange bars, these reflect the share of firms that are not politically connected, but are potentially engaged in high-level corruption. And we see here the importance of paying to high-level officials, to tailoring benefits or laws and policies to their benefits. Of course, this is a perception-based variable. This is not a de facto thing because this is a survey. And the question is as follows: do you think that exchanging favors or paying has an impact on the firm? And we use that as a proxy to conclude that this firm is probably engaged in some form of corruption, or recognizes at least the importance of doing so. For GVC participation, as Nada has already explained, there are 4 definitions of GVCs, and we focus on the first and the last one, so the deepest and the shallowest definition. To participate in GVC, the literature at the firm level lists along a set of determinants that can help firms engaged in GVCs. When we link that to the theory of firm heterogeneity in international trade, we know that firms must overcome a fixed cost to be able to integrate in international trade, be it the global economy in general through exports or imports, or in the form of integrating in global value chains. And this is why political connections may create trends for the politically connected firms, and may also help them to overcome the fixed costs of engaging in global value chains compared to non-connected firms. So this is just to depict the share of politically connected firms and firms that recognize the importance of side payments to high-level officials by mode of GVC participation. So for example, in firms who are engaged in global value chains through exports and imports, the share of politically connected firms is 11%, while the share of the same share is 17% for firms who are engaged in the deepest form of GVC participation. For the firms engaged in global value chains in general, who recognize the importance of these contributions, the share ranges from, 30 to 50%, which is a significant share of firms engaged in the global economy that actually admit that such payments matter for their operations. And finally, the share of firms engaged in global value chains that recognize the importance of collective lobbying at the same time is also significantly high. It ranges from 70 to 86%, depending on the definition of global value chains participation. By mode of GVC participation, so this is the political influence by mode of GVC participation, and we realize that across all modes of GVC participation, the share of politically connected firms and those that potentially pay remains relatively small. It increases for GVC3, which is the mode of GVC participation, including foreign ownership. And this makes us think about the different barriers to foreign direct investment that were tailored sometimes to benefit some businessmen. But at the same time, again, looking at the orange bar, the share of firms that are not politically connected but recognize the importance of payments is substantial. And this makes us consider in the empirical specification not only the share of politically connected firms, but also business-state relations that take the form of grand corruption. So for our methodology, we test the impact of political connections and alternative measures of political influence on global value chains participation. So our left-hand side variable is the GVC participation at the firm level, and we focus on the deepest and the shallowest form. X is a vector of control variables at the firm level that drive GVC participation. The variable political is political connections at the country, firm, and sector level, and we use that interchangeably with firms' contributions, or the importance of firms' contributions, and we use also country sector fixed effects for our regression. For the intensive margin of GVCs, which is the share of exports in total sales of the firm and the share of imported inputs in total intermediates, we use a pooled OLS estimation method. And for the probability that a firm engages in a value chain, which is the extensive margin, we use the linear probability model. We also recognize potential endogeneity, and therefore we use a different set of methods ranging from PSM to an IV approach. Very briefly for the results. So we find that political connections matter systematically for the extensive and intensive margins of global value chains participation. According to our estimations, being politically connected raises the probability for a firm to participate in global value chains from somewhere between 3 to 5 percentage points, and 4 percentage points for the intensive margin. Our controls are mostly in line with the literature on firm heterogeneity in international trade. Now we extend this analysis by also including the idea of grand corruption. So we interact political connections and firms' perception of the importance of contributions, because there has been a small yet a growing body of literature that examines this, also using the newly released World Bank data. So we construct a categorical variable that takes the value of 0 if the firm is not politically influential at all. So it's neither politically connected nor recognizes the importance of contributions. 1 if it's not politically connected but recognizes the importance of contributions. 2 if it's politically connected and does not recognize the importance of contributions. And 3 if it does both of them. So our results actually differ, but what matters for us the most is the last definition, which is the firm being politically connected and eventually recognizing the importance of side payments. And we find that this has a positive and significant impact on GVC participation at the extensive and intensive margin. The implications of that is that political connections may not be enough, and that firms may often resort to payments of large scale to tailor policies and laws in their favor, which is also somehow linked to our descriptive analysis from the stylized facts. Now, the last part of the paper, we examine, because GVCs or GVC participation highly depends on the local environment, the trade policy, and the investment policies as well. So we explore to which extent these firms that are politically connected and do or do not recognize the importance of payments are able to overcome specific trade and investment related barriers and participate in global value chains compared to non-connected, non-influential, and non-contributing firms. We have a selected set of trade and investment policies. This table depicts a few selected trade-related restrictions or factors from trade policy, like trade regulations, technical barriers to trade, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, and tariffs. And we see that being politically connected and recognizing the importance of contributions also tends to have actually sometimes a positive and sometimes a negative coefficient. What that means is that well, first, the results are mixed, but it means that sometimes these barriers tend to matter less for politically connected and potentially contributed firms regarding their participation in value chains, and sometimes they weigh heavier. And we went back to the literature and tried to search why this may be the case, and we found that some of the literature suggests that, as I mentioned at the beginning, being politically connected gives you the access to the policymaker, but does not necessarily give you or does not guarantee that you'll be able to alter the policies and the laws in your favor. So you need to pay for that to maintain the relation and to maintain the influence. So sometimes political connections may cost more, especially for large firms who really have the means to pay for that, compared to the firms that are non-influential. And this may explain our results or our positive coefficients at least. And we do the same for some selected variables from or obstacles from the business environment, and we do find also some mixed results going in line with what I have been explaining. So to conclude, we find that political connections do matter systematically. However, they are not enough, and firms may often resort to side payments also to get things done and to change the overall framework or the policy framework or components of the policy framework in their favor. Because political connections can help reduce the costs and facilitate the procedures associated with trade and investment. However, they can also sometimes cost them more to do so. Our findings, we suggest that they add to the literature on hidden protectionism, because these firms are not only protected, but also because of their protection and because of the privileges that they enjoy, are able to overcome the fixed costs and the productivity threshold which is required to engage in global value chains. So we suggest that there is some sort of hidden protectionism from political connections, and this is likely to offset also the liberalization efforts that MENA countries have been undertaking for over 2 decades now. Of course, because this is related to the institutional part of global value chains, increasing transparency and leveling the playing fields for all firms is necessary. But we all know that this requires deep and long-term institutional reforms and a very high level of transparency in the MENA region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nora. Any questions or comments? Ragi, then Ali.
So you probably know the answer to that, but does the result on global value chains extend to exports? Are politically connected firms more likely to participate in exports as well?
Can you hear? Is it working? Oh, okay. Yes, they are able to export because our first definition is that a firm exports, but it does not only export final products. For example, this is like pure exports that we do not consider, but we focus only on the GVC part, which is a firm imports intermediate inputs and processes it, adds value to it, and then exports it again along a value chain. So the political connections play 2 roles here. The part on the imports, they may be able to evade inspections, for example, or clear goods through the customs much easier, or like pay less, for example, to import these inputs, which gives them a productivity or an advantage.
Simply an export variable, if you just look at whether they export or not, 0-1.
We don't do that. We don't do that, right, Chahir?
Sorry?
We don't do that.
I mean,
not only exports.
Not only exports. They have to be.
I know. I'm asking whether the result extends to whether firms
whether
are
they are
able to
exporting
export.
only.
Yes. Whether they're able to export bet more or not.
No, we haven't tested for that.
We don't test that.
But we can.
We could, but because we're only interested in the GVC part, this is why we didn't do it.
But you believe that the effect through exports can be higher than the one through imports, or?
I'm just trying to understand whether political connections allow you to overcome the fixed cost of exporting in general, or is it specifically something related to participation in global value chain?
I think it would be important, it would be interesting to do that, but I would claim that it does, because the same thing that happens in imports also happens at exports, and I think some of our colleagues have already worked on Tunisia in this part of the exports. They have fine-grained data from Tunisian firms, and that they are able to find that the Ben Ali connected firms were able to evade the inspections and pay less, in general, overcome the barriers related to exporting. So they were able to export more. But it would be interesting also to check that at the MENA level, so for the 6 countries.
Ali?
Thank you, Nora, for the presentation. So I'm wondering about the matching technique. So you mentioned you use propensity score matching. So what is the matching technique? And second, what are the observable variables you use to match, related more to firm characteristics? And Last related question, you mentioned at certain point LPM model, linear probability model. So why not using simply probit in order to build the score? I think you use it to build the score to be used in scoring matching. So what is the rationale to use LPM, not probit? Thank you.
I think,
yes, I think you can answer that better than me.
Two things. First, it was the nearest neighborhood for the matching, and then the observables that we relied on, the firm size, government ownership, same sector, same region, firm age, legal status, and why LPM and not probit. Well, in some of the robustness checks, we were running also a probit model, but we just used the LPM, given that for the intensive margin, we are using an OLS, so just to make the results comparable, to get elasticities and compare them. But we for the extensive margin, we've run regressions with the probit model. I answered all the questions, right? Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting study. And coming from a public policy practitioner background, I really find it challenging for policymakers. So what do you recommend after all the conclusions that we reached in this study? Do we go for political connections, or we go for transparency, particularly in today's era of going back to nationalism and bilateral trade relations versus the multilateral discipline for the past 3 years? So what would you propose as policy recommendations? Thank you.
I mean, I could never propose corruption. This is something that is out of question, even though, I mean, there was this one very challenging paper by one of our colleagues also from ERF a few years ago, where he proved that he was proving that the connected firms are better performers. So why not let's go along with this idea and accept the whole thing? I think it's very hard for me to really go on with this conclusion, especially that we know that some sectors in the MENA region were completely closed to specific people and to specific businessmen. It does not only have an effect on the firm's performance, but some of the studies also suggest that corruption and political connections had a negative effect on all of the sector's performance. So it had negative spillover effects on the rest, because if one firm has the advantages, it also is less likely, because it's actually privileged, has less incentives to innovate and to be productive, and this is why it affects the whole productivity of the sector and the whole growth in the sector as well. These firms sometimes also tend to over-employ people, and this is something to please politically, like the policymaker or the government, and they end up really in low productivity. And some of the literature also suggests that politically connected firms, just like government-owned firms, may be able to enter the market easier, but may not be able to withstand the competition later on and end up exiting the market. So the whole issue is just, it is not going correctly. This is counterproductive. So what I would be recommending, especially in today's world of a growing comeback of industrial policies, is that maybe instead of political connections, you can still give firms some of the benefits through a sound industrial policy. And this should not be by closing a sector and overcoming or overriding specific laws and regulations, or tailoring something to favor a specific firm, but we may tailor laws to favor a specific sector depending on the objective. If you want to foster growth and exports in a sector that is labor intensive, so industrial policy should be tailored in that regard. If we want to engage in value chains in growing sectors, for example, despite the fact that we are capital poor countries, but at the same time, like let's say the energy sector, which is growing now, the clean energy, there may be some industrial policies tailored to favor the growth in specific sectors, but not specific firms and specific individuals. Thank you.
And perhaps just one point to add to what Nora said also. I think given that, as Nora mentioned in the conclusion, that those political connections, at the end of the day, they can represent a hidden protectionism. So this might introduce also a kind of uncertainty, which might reduce the likelihood of, especially foreign investors, to invest in those economies. And that's why at the end of the day, even if it might be a short-term policy that can help firm be part of a value chain, but it can be also a signal, it can give a signal to other investors that there is uncertainty in this country, because if we have those politicians today, they might not be there tomorrow on the one hand, and on the other, they might not be able to survive in the market, given that they were able to overcome the fixed cost of entry just because they are politically connected, not because they are sufficiently productive as predicted by the Mallet's model. Other questions or comments? Yes? Last question. To be on time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very interesting paper, and I would just like to recommend you to check the newly released database from Afrobarometer, because it actually addresses many of the limitations you mentioned regarding the definition of political connectedness. Interestingly, the new database actually accounts for both the direct connections and the indirect connection that you mentioned about the struggle you have with the reviewers, but most importantly, I think, is that it also captures the connections with the military establishment and defense institutions within African countries. Because the argument is that, you know, you can be politically connected, but this doesn't mean anything. But, you know, the most powerful institutions, you know, these military. So please check this one. Another minor comment or suggestion is also to disaggregate this analysis by the sector in which the firms are operating, because by default, especially for the importing firms, you know, some of them might be operating within sectors where the government are investing and the governments are investing. So this means that they can secure long-term deals and procurement deals. So this can also explain their global value chain integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these suggestions. I agree on the first one, and rightly, because exactly you mentioned you can be politically connected, but you can't do anything about it. This is why you also need the payments, and this is why and then the heavy payments and the large-scale payments. Thanks for the suggestion. I was not aware of that database. And for the sector, yes, you are right. I don't know if this is empirically, are we able to do that? Like to look at the sectors? Yes, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments or suggestions?
Okay, if not, so then we can conclude the session. Thank you very much for attending, and see you tomorrow.